Hello again. This is Daniel Kirsch, wanting to talk to you about positivism. And here, let me adjust this light. It's not great. How's that? Maybe a little too dark? I think it'll get brighter. Okay, so positivism is really this kind of catch-all word for it's this philosophical tradition that emerged during the Enlightenment, and it has a lot of very noble goals. And the idea behind positivism is that you can, from empirical scientific observation, you can develop universal laws based on observation. And building a general theory of knowledge is its ultimate project. And to do so, you need to constantly test things that you can observe or which have been that you can attempt to see if they're true or not, objectively true in reality. And there's a number of issues that interpretivists have with this approach, simply because they don't have the same conception about reality that we all do, that positivists do. So positivists and the modern era, they would really call themselves neo-positivists or post-positivists, but they have much of the same structure to the research design that's inspired by positivism, as the overall philosophical proposition has. And so, as long as you can, I believe you can see this, there's a number of elements and kind of vocabulary that you hear a lot when you are talking about either qualitative positivist research design or quantitative positivist research design. And you always hear about the independent variable and the dependent variable. And the independent variable and the dependent variable are very simple. They're the cause and effect that you're trying to establish some kind of relationship about. The variables, you're trying to establish some relationship. And often this is done through a bivariate or multivariate regression, which basically just means you're trying to find a convincing statistical link that can show evidence or not that there is a plausible cause and effect that you can demonstrate universally across these two phenomena. So, for example, when you're talking about politics and you're talking about electoral, political surveys, how much race or religion determines your voting behavior, your partisan affiliation, how much your socioeconomic background dictates whether or not you vote, how much your gender might influence, what your gender identity might influence your attitude towards either certain politicians or certain political parties, or just how much your self-identified political beliefs orient you towards affiliating with one political party or organization or candidate or another. So those are, or you could stack up. A multivariate regression would mean you could stack up all of these answers, like your gender, your race, your religion, your self-identified ideological belief system, what TV shows you watch, and they have surveys like this that ask you all of these kinds of questions, and they can kind of churn out the likelihood of you voting one way or another, or you affiliating with one political party or another. So there is this attitude in a lot of political science, I would dare say most of political science, that as long as you can gather enough accurate data, you can make a prediction that is going to be accurate and reliable and valid. However, the problem or the issue that most interpretivists would take issue with, that positivists tend to take for granted, is what do we mean when we say objective reality? Like, what do we mean when we say that there is that you can universally apply this law? And maybe there is a lot of value in something like a multivariate regression. But sometimes there are things that call the study into question that make it seem like, a multivariate regression assumes that everyone who's giving the answer is giving it in that they understand it the same way, or that they don't believe that there is that there's much of a difference between a person's situation who's answering a multiple choice question in one state and someone who's answering it in another state, who has a totally different context that's not being accounted for by the study. And interpretive research design takes into account the fact that there are many things that tend to go unaccounted for in terms of the variables that are defined and the concepts that are defined in every single social science study that's ever been done. And the idea of trying to, by definition, take a not entirely accurate look at the reality into account and try to generalize for all of reality from that account is philosophically untenable. So in contrast to that, and I'll get to this in the other lecture, interpretivism tends to look at the local context and privilege it over and the kind of what they call the constitutive causality. What people perceive as the important factors of a political phenomenon and political activity, and what people perceive as the important parts of their lives and their perspective, and trying to not generalize, but trying to find the meaning behind the actions that have been taken, or the language that they're engaging in, or the stance they tend to take. So it's very different, because the positivist kind of orientation, which again is admirable and can be useful, what it tends to do is try to treat the people who are answering questions in interviews as people who are subjects that don't sort of know the full picture. They don't know entirely what's being studied, and they answer to the best of their ability, but really the researcher has a much better kind of removed, researcher, I don't have much room over here, but the researcher is much more removed and can see, what the respondent, what the person answering survey questions, the person being interviewed, what they don't see. And to a certain extent, I guess that's always true, but in some ways there's a much higher premium on I won't say that. There's a much higher likelihood that you are simply getting people to ask questions to almost reinforce the theory, the hypothesis that you've already stepped into this research project with. So that's kind of a big philosophical drawback of positivism, is that you undertake the research to confirm the kind of small theory you've already built, and you can't then alter it when you find that the information has been contradicted, when your theory has been contradicted. So one advantage I would say to interpretivism is that you can, in this process, they tend to be able to go back and forth and kind of redesign the research design, but also the orientation is that you are not really that removed from the research process as a researcher. You are in it, and you are attempting to be as transparent as possible about your limitations as a researcher and your perspective, while attempting to really privilege the people who are providing you with the information, with the perspective, with the analytical, ability that they have, having lived and living in whatever situation or world that you are attempting to document. And so there's more ability to, and there tends to be fewer respondents in qualitative interpretive work, and they tend to be able to give more open-ended answers in interviews, and researchers tend to be able to ask more specific follow-up questions. But back to positivism, what you will hear, and if any of your friends are taking another research methods course anywhere else this semester, you will hear them ask questions like, what is your dependent variable and your independent variable? You've already heard me give an example of what those are. How do you operationalize your variable? In other words, how do you put into effect, how do you test the hypothesis or the theory that you've developed about what's going on in terms of cause and effect in this political action? Are you operationalizing, for example, race by denoting, okay, that there are 5 racial categories that I'm allowing in this variable, in this independent variable structure of my study. So we're just going to say African American, Asian American, Latinx American, and non-Latinx or non-Hispanic white American, and then other. Okay, and then we're just going to say other, and so that right away you might say, oh well, in that operationalization you are neglecting a vast category. You are maybe capturing 80%, maybe 90% of the U.S. population with those 4 categories that you have identified. But for the other 20%, you're neglecting, obviously I just did this very quickly, so I neglected Native Americans. But there are subcategories of Asian Americans that racially tend to not identify with each other in terms of maybe Southeast Asian or Central Asian. But then also, there's let's not forget people who have immigrated and we're saying American to all of these things. Maybe they don't consider themselves American, or maybe they're not. Maybe they haven't been naturalized as U.S. citizens. So there's all these different categories of people that have been left out of this concept of this operationalized independent variable. That just so we'll see the differences between those 3 or 4 large categories. Yes, we will see those, but what we won't see is maybe some data that would call into question what some of these categories even are. We will see just what we expected to see in the first place. Is it falsifiable? So when you test something, you're supposed to be testing a theory that race determines party, okay, and your racial identity determines party, for example. So is that falsifiable? You have to be able to say, is it yes or no? Is it testable? And certainly, if you were to test with that operationalized variable, you'd be able to get an answer, yes or no. But what would that really tell you? It'd tell you that you designed a good research design, but I don't know that it would tell you if it really answers your question, whether race in the U.S. currently, determines your party affiliation or vice versa. Replicability. There's a bit in your textbook that I would urge you to make sure you take a look at about replicability, and in terms of replicability, it's usually the gold standard in social sciences if you can replicate your study, especially in positivist research, whether you can take those same variables and that same study, do it again, and would you get the same results? And if the answer is yes, that's supposed to mean that you've kind of created an airtight, very structurally sound, as well as kind of ethically responsible research study. Really, replication is a very, 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 very marginal part of the kind of research that people do. It's just the standard that people have. And so if you have a standard that very few people actually test, then it doesn't seem, the argument the book makes in a very charitable way. The argument that the book makes is that replicability is sort of irrelevant to social science research, and thus, the fact that it's a central standard is problematic. And a couple of other things that tend to be irrelevant to interpretive research. So forming a concept or operationalizing a variable to be able to perfectly create, and we'll go over this more when we talk about concepts in the Schaefer book and elucidating social science concepts. Concept formation is a way to create a concept that may seem familiar but has a very particular definition within this social science study that you're undertaking. And interpretive research sees no reason to do that. Interpretive research tries to find on the ground what their subjects think of a particular concept and run with it. And not just run with it, but also try to find how many different types of understandings there are of a concept or of a political phenomenon within the world that they are attempting to study. So that's a very particular thing. So for example, it's not the best example, but I'll give it anyway. So I wrote a book about the politics of student loans, and I interviewed many people, and I read the testimonies of many people, and they had this narrative. Most people had this narrative within the world of student loans that I was studying, and I was talking to all kinds of people who were inhabitants of that world. They didn't geographically live together, but they all worked on this issue, or they were all borrowers, or they were journalists, or they were attorneys, they were advocates, they were various kinds of activists about the politics of student loans. And some of them, a lot of them, talked about the phrase doing everything right and good citizenship. And outside of the context of the massive kind of student loan crisis that we have, doing everything right and good citizenship don't necessarily translate to anything to do with student loans. But doing everything right to them meant that they took out student loans to further their education. And being a good citizen meant paying their bills on time. And so that doesn't really fit with the rest of good citizenship as you might hear it in a PS 101 class, and doing everything right, might not fit with moral philosophy. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but they were doing what they thought they were supposed to do. And so in this context, I tried to flesh out what doing everything right meant, and what good citizenship meant, and what it would mean in return if we were to kind of take that concept out a little further. But in concept formation, doing everything right, you would have had to just decide that before you interviewed anyone. What did doing everything right mean, and what did citizenship mean? And then I would have asked these questions in a questionnaire, and I would have had no way to follow up, and I would have had nothing to to do after my study was done. I basically wouldn't have had anything useful to say, whereas I thought all these people that I talked to had something very useful to say. So that's one example of how concept formation is not really relevant in interpretive research. Validity. So, if you see that there's an objective reality, there is something that's valid or something that's invalid in terms of the research study that you've put together. In interpretive research design, really there's nothing like that. If questions are answered in a way that means that people are lying, for example, then that's data. And we'll read an article about that later on. But that's good data or bad data, it's just data. For a more positivist research design, if they didn't answer the question correctly, or if they said something that was untrue when you're trying to get at the truth of the situation, then that is what is going to throw a wrench in your research design, because this person you're relying on, sort of like witness testimony to determine innocence or guilt, it's an unreliable witness, so you have to throw it out. Whereas interpretive research design, like, oh, what did this person perceive, and why do they feel like the need to lie, and so it's relevant to interpretive research design. Kind of takes into account the research process. And the variable relationship, there's no universalizing in interpretive research design as there is in positive research design. In positivist research design, or neo-positive or post-positivist research design, there's an attempt to establish the cause and effect relationship of variables, as I've said. But in interpretive research design, your job is to interpret with your own reasoning, with your own logic, and with the in concert with research that has already been done, the truth, the trustworthiness, and on your own, kind of how reliable the people are who have spoken to you, and try to find the meaning behind their interpretations, their own interpretations. And very often, there's a disagreement right now among interpretivists about whether you should have to go back and show your research, the results of it, to kind of the finished product or the almost finished product, to people who have contributed to your research design and to your research, and there's some people think there's not necessarily a need for that, because they might just take out things that are unflattering. But really it serves as a check to say, okay, is this what you meant? And if they say, yes, this is what I meant, and if you disagree with it, that's okay. That's the idea, is they shouldn't be able to have a veto power over your work, but it is a way for you to sort of verify that this is the contribution they intended to make to this conversation. And so you're less of a all-knowing researcher and more just someone who's trying to understand a little bit more deeply. So that's the idea behind, that's the kind of contrast that interpretivists would say about variables. And finally, I do want to just get at a little bit of this this contrast between the kind of various forms of logic that the three traditions have. And in positivism, there's, you've heard, Sherlock Holmes and many others use the logic of deduction, and induction is this other form. So in positivism, all has to do with universal theories, and deduction in a lot of quantitative studies, you start with a universal theory of what tends to happen, and what we've seen happen in social science often, again and again, and then you form a particular hypothesis about it, and you try to that follows from that universal theory. Race and gender plus age plus socioeconomic status equals long-term party affiliation, and test that with observations, and say, okay, in this particular election cycle, was that true? Could you actually add up those variables and get a dependent variable that matches up the kind of cause and effect relationship that we understand from that theory? If we test it with those observations, then we should be able to confirm or falsify that theory. So that's deduction. Induction tends to be also positivist, but it's attempting to make these universal laws from particular case studies. So it's kind of the mirror image of it. Whereas interpretive research design is this iterative process where you can kind of go back and forth between the existing theory and what you see on the ground, and try to see how they question each other, and how your new research might expand or enrich the existing sets of theories that are out there. So that's what a lot of the differences are, and we will talk more about the specifics of interpretive design very shortly.